So first off, I'm going to focus probably more on the imminent because I think that's exciting and it's right after lunch. And so I thought it would be amusing. And try to emphasize what are some new emerging capabilities. And so, a lot of this might be geared to essentially those EOVs that fall now in the category we can't measure them today, but the technology's coming along very quickly. First off, motivation. We all have to show our reasons we care about the Antarctic. So we know that the circumpolar current plays this mammoth role in regulating the area. My interests lie a lot in the West Antarctic Peninsula, which is melting very rapidly. And it's being melted by the position of this circumpolar current relative to it, where essentially pieces of the circumpolar current break off at the shelf slope front and come ashore in eddies. These eddies are pretty small. They're about 30 kilometers in scale. They got the rotation, and they're episodic with a lifetime of about 6.6 days. You can't see them from space, and yet it's the heat engine that's essentially melting everything in terms of a heat budget. And so traditional ship sampling is going to be very hard-pressed to sample it. We got a general geographic area where we think the eddies are. ROMS models are starting to capture it, Dinnaman and ODU, so we might be able to go there. So we have this dynamic, large-scale global processes driving shelf processes, but the heterogeneity on the shelf is large, which is a problem. This other problem, systems dynamic, it's changing. We've heard this, so here's a 10-year sort of change in ice concentration, so you can see sort of the two areas that have been growing relative to the two that are melting. So we're seeing large changes. This is the winter air temperature along the West Antarctic Peninsula, so a lot of interannual variability. But overall, it's about over a degree per decade, only in wintertime, the water is, that the atmosphere is warming. The summer temperatures are about the same. However, this year, we were at 55 degrees and I was in short sleeves at sea. So, do it. The changes in the physics is being expressed in the WAP and the biology. In terms of plants, we're seeing it both on the land and in the ocean. On the land, well, we're starting to find plants on land, and the question is how quickly soil will form as we melt it back, and then to what degree you start getting these invasive plant species moving in. Ohio State scientists actually found mushrooms from South America had taken root on one of the islands in the West Antarctic. So, we're at a point where when will we have rooted plants on the peninsula is not necessarily an impossibility in our lifetime. In terms of marine systems, you got to look at longer time scales to be able to capture a change. You can't do it on a 20-year time series. That's what we have for the LTER. So this is sort of comparing CZCS time frame versus CWIF's time frame. And in the southern part of the peninsula, we see an increase in the chlorophyll over that time period. And that's simply because a lot of this used to be covered with ice. And now we've essentially melted back the ice cover and we have more solar illumination. Up to the north, King George, Inver's Island, large declines. And it probably correlates with essentially increased wind forcing, which we believe drives deeper mixed layer depths, as well as a significant increase in cloud cover. And it's already, from a plant's perspective, a dark ocean. So attenuating the light at the surface actually is significant. And then that's driving all the way through to the highest trophic levels. So these are the Adelie penguin populations at Palmer Station. They're collapsing. Last few years that have been colder, essentially we've leveled out. We haven't seen decline. And we're seeing the evasions of new species, chin straps, gentooths, just like you see in the seafloor where, there's this potential new king crab coming in to consume the benthic communities. So we have a very dynamic system, a very complicated system, and this is how we're trained to go to sea. And it's actually not too far from the truth. A good research vessel isn't that much faster than a good 10-speed bike with someone who's healthy doing it. And if you're a biologist especially, you're taking bottle samples. And so it's, at least you're getting a depth profile with bottles, but, essentially you're getting a very limited view. And on top of it, if we're doing ship sampling, the conditions you can sample is limited by the conditions you're allowed to work on deck. Luckily, graduate students, the paperwork is less, so you can send them out, but again, there's a limitation to when you can be out there. So ultimately, the solution for this, it didn't work, is new technology. And Matt sort of was showing examples of that on a global scale model with his simulation models. And so what we've been doing is pulling essentially technology being developed in other places of the area. So, but essentially, again, it's new observation schemes, radars, satellites, AUVs to give you essentially a nowcast, a simulation into models to give you a forecast back and forth. And that's been maturing really nicely. And the move to a lot of the coastal and regional models is moving beyond having your one model. It's essentially now running ensembles of models like you might do for a weather service in forecast mode. So you can essentially look at the variance between models. You can then go look at the assumptions made in each model. And what's interesting is not when a model gets it right. What's really interesting is when the model gets it wrong, because you can start tracing back what were the fundamental assumptions that were driving that. And these technologies are now beginning to migrate down to the Southern Ocean, which is great. So this is at Palmer Station. Have installed a high-frequency radar network where essentially you're getting hourly updates of the surface currents. It's pretty cost-effective. They're pretty robust. They were hardened by the groups up in Alaska over the years. So not only can it handle cold, if grizzly bears ever actually get down to the peninsula, these guys will be able to withstand that. And it gives you a synoptic view that essentially fills in the gap when you don't have satellite imagery. And you can derive a lot of useful products. For the penguin biologists, this has actually been the most important one, where you can essentially look at where you have convergence or divergence in the water column to essentially go where's material accumulating, and then overlay that where the penguins are foraging, and you find actually pretty good correlations. And it's all based on real-time observations being delivered. If you scale up and you go, well, that's great. You can do that around a field station. Can you actually do it regionally? Well, high-frequency radar is pretty much filled in a lot of the U.S. The Gulf and Alaska is what we have left to do. And so you can actually very cost-effectively fill up large, significant areas with ranges of 200 to 300 kilometers offshore. And so you can actually get real-time circulation patterns in that nearshore coastal. And then as you get further and further out, you can start using some of those altrometric geostrophic approaches. And so the idea is that you build a nested grid to essentially resolve the processes of interest. We're going to need the in situ, of course. So out in the open ocean, we're going to have some more talks. The expansion of the Argo array down in the south, both in the open water under ice, and the bioargos that SOCOM is going to be doing in terms of biogeochemistry is going to be a revolution. And so yesterday there were those plots that were essentially carving up the Southern Ocean into sectors: open ocean, open water, under ice, continental shelf. And really, we're at an exciting point where that sector of the open water, open shelf is kind of getting to where we can maybe address what Steve was asking earlier. Are we getting close to fulfilling our needs in terms of observations? How close are we so we can get over the hump? And we're actually going to be at a point, hopefully in 5 years or less, where we can not only do it for temperature and salinity and physics, but maybe some of the classic biogeochemical parameters, pH, nutrients, and potentially chlorophyll. As you move on to the continental shelf, you usually need more active control. And the other great revolution that's happened beyond some of the remote sensing approaches is we've gone into this robotic revolution. And if your Visa card is big enough, you can essentially buy big AUVs, you can buy very small AUVs. And the big revolution that's happened since I've been playing with these is they transitioned to being engineering projects. When I first was involved with REMIS and this or that, it was one token scientist allowed to work with about 30 engineers, and you would fly 10 yards and pick it up and declare victory and go home, to now where junior faculty come in and their startup packages are often based on buying these platforms. And so it's transitioned to science tools. And so the revolution of platforms, to me, has sort of come and it's sort of gone. And now we're moving into the revolution of sensors of what they can do. And so my particular interest has been in autonomous gliders, Slocum gliders. And as a research group, sort of bootlegging it through grants here or there, you can maintain a pretty nice presence at sea. Our lab, over the last really 6 years, have spent about 533 days at sea, covering about almost just under 10,000 kilometers of data. The LTR, when I joined, had something on the order of 400 profiles from the ship. It's 800. And that was eclipsed within one field season with one glider. So the resolution of what you can see is dramatic. So all these blue lines here are essentially glider tracks run out of the Palmer Station following penguin foraging and upwelling in the canyon. At the same time, these systems have shown that you can link field stations. So we've flown from Palmer down to Rothra. Rothra has gliders now, so the idea is that we send up these conduits to essentially fill in when the ships aren't there. Because now we can do it with the advent of good lithium batteries. That was really the thing that was holding that up. Given that this is the first time I'm physically in Australia, it's not the first time I've been in Australia scientifically, I wanted to emphasize the other big revolution has been Iridium. Global telepresence allows us to do science we couldn't do before. So as an example, we were flying here in Australia. Our colleagues essentially put a glider in off Perth. We went to bed because of the time zone difference. When we came back, it had been surfaced near a guy's fishing boat who was drinking beer. He went into this boat basin. You could track it. He drove outside of Perth down Highway 64 or 35, wherever, but he lived right there in this house, had the glider in his front lawn. And we turned altimeters on and off, and it woke up this neighbor. This was during the Gulf War, and so it's got a big American flag on it. It's got the wings, so it looks like a cruise missile. So she threatens to call the police. He panics, so he drives back into Perth to the warehouse district and dumps it in a grove of trees behind a warehouse and drives away. We were tracking the whole thing so our Australian colleagues could go pick it up and throw it back in the water after dusting it off and run a mission. And it's kind of a fun story, but at the same time, if you think back 20 years ago, this idea of streaming data and real-time geolocation is going to change how we go to sea and what we can do. And it's an amazing revolution. We're still getting a handle of what we can do. So the platforms are here. So where are some of the areas the technology is going in my mind? Well, one are the sensors. And there's a whole cottage industry springing up of doing exotic sensors for measurements you used to be only relegated to the lab. And I'm a phytoplankton guy, so it's very biased to that. Here's an example. This is a customized, essentially it's a seaboard spectrophotometer giving you hyperspectral absorption and allows you to signal process for individual diatom species versus red tide species in the Gulf of Mexico. So you can actually start getting to the point where you're discriminating specific algal species. Holographic imaging is being ported onto gliders now in an experimental mode. So small zooplankton and grazers consume the image. Multi-acoustics, multi-frequency acoustics is a big topic of discussion. And instruments such as Heidi Sosic's submersible flow cytometer, when she started a few years ago, it was, the size of this open area right here. It weighed a ton, and it was the dedicated thing. To now, it's a commercial sensor you can buy out of McLean. And it'll essentially identify individual phytoplankton species for you automatically at sea. And discussions are already away of how to port these on to these mobile platforms. So an EOV such as phytoplankton diversity was an impossible thing that might be critical for some big SOOS issues. In 5 years is not going to be an impossible thing. The data analysis and the big data aspects, that will be the challenge. Chemistry is another one. So this is a mass spectrometer. It's about the size of 3 Coke cans. It's tuned for some specific elements. And this is essentially carried in Remus vehicles. It was built for explosive sniffing. But there's no reason that these can't be tuned for the environmental variables we need. So sensors are evolving very rapidly. The other things that are evolving really rapidly is the robots are starting to become smart. One thing is sort of track optimization, the brains to do that. Here, a scientist will say, get to the shelf break. Just give me a cross-shore line. I want to repeat that. And what you have is the glider now look at essentially the currents it's feeling and optimizes path to surf. So essentially, when you're telling it to go to this location, you're playing basketball. I got to get the glider right in that hoop. And then you're transitioning to rugby, where I just got to get across the goal line and optimize my path, because I don't really care where I'm going. One step further was an example where we had the glider essentially log on to the web, grab CODAR data, that high-frequency radar, and adjust its own location on its own based on measured information from another data stream. And so a lot of these technologies become integrated and allow you to do it, and so it works. The other thing is you might train your system to actually start looking for features. So here we've essentially developed some technology where you essentially have the glider locate and then oscillate around the thermocline. So as you get small features and everything like that, you can optimize your sampling for it. And you're not doing it, if you look at AutoSub, it's such an elegant AUV in terms of what it's got in terms of behavior, but that makes it extremely expensive. The revolution here is you're talking about a relatively cheap AUV, and anything under $200,000 is cheap. But now you're starting to get some of the functionalities you might actually get in the more expensive ones. And the reason that this is important is you might carry a range of sensors. There's two groups actually building water samplers and filtration units for gliders. You might carry a cartridge of 12 to see. The question is when do you take your sample? And so here you can essentially start thinking about having the glider look at its own environmental data, and then you give it the rules of when a sample should be taken and preserved for later analysis. So then, if you scale that up, you're going to start moving to swarms. And so the question is how do you sample with swarms of systems? Well, one is you might be wanting to sample the environment, and the great thing is animals, seals, whales, and penguins, through evolution, have become very good at sampling the environment. And so the idea is that you use the radio-tagged animals and their behaviors to essentially coordinate your AUV array. So this particular year, we had radio-tagged penguins, real-time stream back. We would essentially create on the fly foraging kernels that essentially were programmed for propellered Remus vehicles to essentially then get high-resolution maps in areas of high foraging. So you could essentially map, here's the chlorophyll fluorescence where the penguins were foraging. You could do the frequency, and then you could compare that to the diet samples collected from the penguins and start calibrating your acoustic signals. And so the idea for some of these ecosystem processes about linking those together is doable. That's doable for about 8 to 10 gliders per technician. When you get above 10 gliders per technician, that's when they start to die. And that's expensive just because you got to retrain the people after that. So the question is how do we scale up? And you're going to have to move to machine networks. So we've been playing games there. And the idea is you're running a regional model. You're running it in forecast mode. In your forecasts, you have imaginary gliders flying in your hypothetical future ocean. You're using that then to adjust where you fly your gliders that are actually in the real ocean. And then you collect a bunch of data based on that. And then via data assimilation, you improve the model forecast. And so it's a complete loop. The human just sits in here and is looking at the data streams and is trying to optimize what process they want to sample. I want to sample a river plume. I want to sample a meltwater lens. I want to sample a foraging area. And you start handing control in terms of the flight navigation, in terms of waypoints over the course of the day, to the model. You take the human out of the loop. So my modeling friends convinced me to let them do this. It was not something I took lightly. Simply because I'm an observationalist. Why would I believe a modeler? So you're looking essentially at gliders, multiple gliders, controlled for, essentially almost 9 days. And the black line here is essentially the model resolution. And this is the position difference of where the glider should have been controlled by the model versus where it ended up. So if you're above this line, the glider didn't get where it was supposed to. If you're below the line, you're working as well as the model can do because you're at the, essentially the model resolution. So my first plot, and I saw these, and being an observationist, well, the models suck. But actually, then you go back and you look more carefully. This is a compass failure. This is the glider didn't call in time and laid uplinks. And so the models, especially as we start tuning them in regions, they're going to be nested within the Maslov world of super high resolution global models, are essentially going to give us real-time data fields that essentially are going to take over a lot of our flight navigation, which is what kills your technicians. It's the waypoint updates over the course and adjusting that on the fly. And the models can do that. We can take that one step further, which is let's link that up now to the other assets. So we had the gliders controlled by the models. We had the gliders called into the NASA event planning system and have it upload coordinates to the Hyperion satellite, which is a tiltable swath satellite. So essentially hand over this satellite to one of the gliders that was controlled by a model. And so here's the Hyperion swath. This is the glider that essentially called in and reoriented. This swath was supposed to be somewhere inland here. And so in my mind, what was amazing was this glider was really being coordinated only by numerical models, and it was in turn controlling the satellite approach, and the human was out of that loop. And that's a scalable system that in continental shelf systems that have a lot of forcing require a little more control than out in the deep ocean. These systems complement each other. It's sort of, as you need nested resolution increase as you move inshore, your observation networks now have the capabilities of doing that. So the journey's just starting, but I think the technology is really an exciting place. We can start actually thinking about experiments we couldn't before. And it comes at a good time because the Southern Ocean is a dramatically important place that we need to get a better resolution on. And the technologies are mature enough. And we're seeing that from all the groups that have been talking so far. Seb's example is good. And as the technology evolves, it's going to change the types of science we can do. So those episodic events that are impossible to sample using classical techniques, now we really have the tools to do it. And if you combine that with ensemble modeling, data assimilation, and all those approaches, you can start doing spatial statistics and analysis, kind of like Matt showed us before the lunch, to give us really synthetic understanding. So this was they said give an inspirational talk after lunch. And so I think we're in for a great ride, and it's going to be exciting. So thank you very much.
Definitely inspirational. Thanks so much. Do you have any questions for us? Going for a few minutes. Tom.
Do people ever put the radars on ships?
They don't. There's the two parts to that. You can put the receivers on the ships pretty easily. When you put the transmitter, you worry more about motion. However, you can fill in your field very easily with moorings, acting as the receivers because they don't care it, and you essentially go to sort of an n-squared look at a pixel because any place they overlap, you can combine and make a multi-static array. So, when I look at like certain areas, it's about finding right outcrops, ice sheets, this or that, and using that as your base, looking out, and the goal should be, can we get the radars with enough resolution to get us out near the continental slope? So then we can use the deep ocean model we have more confidence in on that side to fill in for the deep ocean out.
I just wonder about the temporal resolution you have in your data.
We know that the process is going on there, it's taking place at sometimes very short time and space. But as far as I can see, the glider resolution will not resolve that issue.
I mean, you definitely will need to adjust what you're looking at with the system. You know, if you swarm gliders, which is what we've done looking at internal wave dynamics, where we essentially line them up to essentially catch the wave as it's coming on the continental slope. So there's creative ways to do that. But the AUVs have matured dramatically too. The Remus is this or that, and they can maintain now a pretty sustained presence out in there. And so it's more about how you might use the gliders to give you the mean state, and then you might use your Remus to give you those fluctuations around the mean, you know, depending on the process.
Can you say something about combining stationary mooring equipment and combine it with glider? Wouldn't that also be a
Yeah, no, that's a great way. I mean, and there's advantages to that because, well, one, you obviously get a real time series from your fixed point of presence, and then you get this sort of semi-Lagrangian perspective with a glider. But you can have them interact in the sense of one can act as a gateway communication system for the other. So if you look at the OOI program to save money on some of the deep ocean moorings, they don't have surface expression. And down in the Antarctic, that's a good idea because of ice. So the glider actually acts as the data mule. It goes down and through acoustic modems, retrieves the data from the mooring, and it carries it back. So there's a lot of really interesting ways you might combine a lot of these platforms. And I don't think it's going to replace ships because you still want humans at sea, but we want to maximize their time to do experiments and process studies. You know, we want to take the mapping and the when and where to sample out of the equation for them. Yeah.
One very short one, if anyone's got anything. No. So,